Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Finding You podcast. This is Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, October 29, 2024. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, narcissism and the narcissistic wound. It's my favorite for a few reasons. Number one, I think it's one of the mental health issues in our society that still is open, fair game for people to talk about in an insulting way, in a cruel way. There are a couple of those, but this is one of those. And secondly, because I think it's largely misunderstood, both in what creates it, what it is, and also how to heal or transform it. And then lastly, I think it's because of how applicable it is to all of us. So I'll talk about that in just a moment. Before I do, I want to get into what pays the bills for this evening. Finding You therapy programs. Our next Finding You intensive. This is an individual intensive, an intensive for individuals. We host it outside of Park City, Utah, with 7 individuals. I happen to be running the next in-person intensive, so that'll be December 4th through 8th. And it is a deep dive, an immersion into your family of origin, into your past, into your history, to understand the relationship that you have with yourself and to understand really all of your other relationships. We believe and subscribe to the idea that the relationship that we have with ourselves forms the basis for all of our relationships. So if you've experienced trauma, you're looking for a jump start into your work. If you're in therapy and feeling stuck and want an accelerator, or if you're just looking to have an experience that is going to be transformative in your life, Finding You Intensive, our flagship program, is that opportunity. So often people come to us wanting a couples intensives or a family intensive, maybe even a one-on-one intensive. And I always try to encourage them to consider strongly our flagship Finding You Intensive because it is a special place. It's an experience that almost every client walks away with the highest level of satisfaction, exceeding their expectations. So, Finding You Intensives, we have an online version of it that's 3 days, November 15th through 17th, and then a 5-day, 4.5-day intensive outside of Park City, Utah, December 4th through 8th. That's the one I will be running coming up soon. So, I look forward to that. So, let's get into tonight's topic about narcissism. Before I begin, I just want to tell you all that having been raised by human parents with limited resources, we all have some narcissistic wounding and we all have some narcissism. And I'm going to explain what that is and why that is as I go along this evening. First of all, I want to share a couple of stories to set the table for this evening. The first one is I've told this before where I was traveling with a friend and I came across a meme from social media. We were waiting for an appointment. We had a few minutes to waste some time and look at our phones. And so I found this meme that talked about our family of origin. It said something along the lines of if you tell a friend that your father was not a good father, their response was probably going to be something like, screw him. He was no good for you. You can find happiness away from him. If you say that about your mother, and the joke was, you might often hear somebody respond with, well, she did her best. And I'm sure that she loved you. I shared this with the friend that was standing next to me, a woman that I work with. And after reading it, she chuckled and she thought to herself, said out loud to me, I don't think this really applies to my family, to my mother. And I said, okay. I thought it was just a clever way of talking about the narcissistic wounding in any parent. And then just a moment later, she said to me, I was actually thinking about sharing this, posting this on my own story, my own social media. And the first thing I thought to myself was, is my mother going to see this and how will she feel about that? Everybody that I know, everybody that I've ever met has some version of this inability to understand and incorporate the parts of themselves that they've been told to hate, that they've been told were unacceptable, the human parts of themselves. In one of his books, James Hollis, one of my favorite writers, as you probably know, in the middle passage, he begins by telling the story of a grown man talking to his father and sharing with him some of his feelings about his own childhood and some of the needs that went unmet in his own childhood. And after sharing these feelings, this story with his father went in and went about rebutting the story and tried to show childhood pictures and show the child, who now was an adult, that he had a good childhood. And all Hollis says after telling the stories, he said, "We see at this point that the father's narcissistic womb was in full bloom." He says it that simply. The strongest sign, or the simplest sign maybe, of the narcissistic wound of narcissism in any of us is the inability to listen. Specifically, the inability to take in any distress, any disagreeable feelings from somebody else, especially when those feelings are directed towards us or about us, without defending ourselves. If you can listen, if you can hear your loved one, if you can hear your friend, your client, your coworker, and you can hear their complaints and take those in without defending yourself, in that moment, you are not displaying the narcissistic wound, the desire to be seen, the need to be seen as good and lovable and worthy. When I went to graduate school, and I hear this story all the time from graduate students, when I went to graduate school and we were first studying the diagnoses and we came across any one of them, the practically universal experience from students was that we saw ourselves in all the diagnoses. And as professors had become accustomed to this, they had a planned response, and they assured us that we didn't qualify for all these diagnoses. I've never taught a college course, at least not an entire course. I've been a guest speaker a couple of times. But if I taught that course on diagnostics in my class, the members of my class came away with that feeling that they could see themselves, my response to them would be quite different. My response to them would be, good. I'm glad you can see aspects of yourself in all of these things. That's the sign of a healed, well-rounded person. That's evidence of this lack of narcissism. That means that you can see yourself in your client, and what greater gift to any client, to any loved one for that matter, is there beyond being able to see them, to relate to them, to connect to them at a very human level. From The Drama of the Gifted Child, Alice Miller writes, parents have also have to be able to tolerate their children's disappointments, resentment, and even anger when their wishes aren't granted, when they are pushed to work out problems on their own, or when they are frustrated. A routine theme among the parents of my distressed teens is their inability to tolerate their children's unhappiness, especially when it's directed at them. I'll add that. This is what I'm describing. If you have made peace with yourself, if you have come to know yourself, and I really should say, to the extent that you've made peace with yourself, or come to know yourself, because can anybody really know themselves completely? I would argue that they can't. But to the extent that you come to know yourself and made peace with yourself, you can hear other people's distress. You can hear the people that you care about when they're frustrated. You can hear them when they're angry, when they're sad, when they're hurt, when they're disappointed. If you haven't integrated, meaning that you haven't made peace with the parts of yourself, with the aspects of yourself that you were told to dislike, then when somebody comes and sees those, reflects that back to us, tells us that they're upset, they're hurt, they're angry with us, we will defend ourselves. And what's more, I think, insidious and problematic with that defense is we make the problem about them. We make them the problem. We tell them how they're wrong, how they've misinterpreted things, how they've been misunderstood. Remember, defensiveness doesn't feel like defensiveness most often when it's coming, when you're looking at it from the inside. Defensiveness feels like the thought comes to us when we're feeling defensive. They don't understand me. They don't see the whole truth. They don't get my story. They don't get me. That's what defensiveness feels like. And again, if you made peace with yourself, if you've integrated yourself, if you accept yourself, if you've learned to love, I'll use the term that I like to use, tolerate, because sometimes that's what it feels like. Tolerate the aspects of yourself that you were told not to like, not to display, not to be. If you learn to love and integrate those parts of yourself, then when somebody else presents something to you about those parts, there's no need for the defense. You would more likely say, or at least this is the energy that you would come back with, saying something like, you have no idea. You've only scratched the surface of this particular character fault of mine. Thank you for telling me. I'm glad you're talking about it. I'm glad you're sharing with me how you feel. That's what the recovering, healed narcissist sounds like. I talked about this recently. All of these recent broadcasts seem to be going in a line. And I talked about Melanie Klein, who was a contributor and creator of something called object relations in psychology. And she talked about the two positions in human beings, the two developmental positions. She reduced the development of humans into two categories. And he said the first position is the paranoid position. The paranoid position is when we see the problem is out there. The badness, the enemy is out there. What that looks like in our lives is we make the problem the identified patient. We don't see it as a systemic problem. Right? Those are the parents or loved ones, spouses who say to me, I'm not the one with the problem. They're the one with the drinking problem. I might have my limitations and weaknesses, but I'm functioning well. I'm not the one getting kicked out of school. I'm not the one getting fired. I'm not the one losing my license. I'm not the one ending up drunk and passed out at the family party. So the problems, the idea of the badness in us that we feel gets projected outward onto the identified patient, or oftentimes the child or the spouse or the co-parent or the ex-spouse. We actually believe, and I think we have some experience with the sense that they are the ones making us unhappy. We don't know that it's what's going on inside of our head, how we're interpreting what they're saying and what they're doing, the meaning that we're making out of it. Yes, we're going to experience sadness and pain, and that's part of a normal, healthy, well-rounded life. But this fundamental position of projecting outward is the paranoid phase, the paranoid position, as she calls it. Secondly, she refers to the depressed position, and that is simply that the problem is in me. That means that I've integrated the parts of myself that I have split off, that I have rejected, that I have forced into the unconscious or into the shadow, that part of me that I don't see. I've taken those parts back. I own them. And I take responsibility for my own happiness, my own sadness, my own serenity. As the saying goes in Al Anon, I'm responsible for my own serenity. And as I've talked about in my marriage, we have a saying in our marriage that I'm responsible for my happiness. That's my job. You're not, your job is not to make me happy. That's my responsibility. And it's not my responsibility to make you happy. That is your job. We talk about that all the time. That's the depressed position. That means we've integrated. That means we have developed a greater sense of mental health. We are empowered. In essence, we are free. Because the good news about the depressed position, as hard and quote unquote depressing as it might feel or be, the good news is if the problem is in me, then I can fix it. If the problem is out there, then I'll spend my time trying to control and change and fix people over which I have very little to no control. That's a powerless position to be in. And the audacity to be you, I wrote this. There are two primary courses to take when we encounter someone who seems so different or so much more depraved than us. First, we find out what is in common between us. We find it because we have had the courage to look deeply in ourselves, inside of ourselves, and realize that there are fewer differences than we imagined or that we had hoped. The second course through this is to turn the other person into a monster. This course requires very little capacity. We turn our hurt and our fear into anger and hate. I've said this many times. I use this in therapy when it's appropriate. Numberless times people have come to me and told me my ex is a narcissist. My ex is an alcoholic. My ex is, pick the diagnosis, XYZ. Narcissism is one of the favorites of this particular category. And by the way, in some ways, they're wrong. Sorry about that. There was a power surge. I'm going to start over again. In some ways, they're never wrong. In some ways, what we're identifying is narcissism and narcissistic traits. But the question that I pose, the way that I respond to this question so often is in saying to them, I say, it's interesting. It's interesting that your ex is a narcissist or an alcoholic. But what's really compelling, what's really fascinating. Okay. Looks like I'm having some technical difficulties. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me and see me? Okay, I'm back. I'm going to go back a little bit. When I do the podcast version of this, of course, I'll edit all of this out. Thank you for your patience, and I'm very sorry for the interruption. So often, people have come to me in therapy or in other contexts and told me about their ex being a narcissist or an alcoholic or pick your diagnosis. And while in many cases there's some truth to what they're saying, it's because narcissism is such a universal aspect of the human personality. It's true. I can see it in other people. But what I say to folks when they share that with me is I say, you know, it's interesting that your ex is a narcissist or an alcoholic or borderline personality disorder. That's interesting. But what's really fascinating, what's really compelling is why did you marry or why did you couple up with a narcissist? What is it in you that drew you to them? Answering that question is helpful. Answering that question is, in essence, healing and addressing the narcissistic wound in you, the one that's complaining. Narcissism can come in two general forms. It can look depressed or grandiose. Grandiose is the more classic version. It's the malignant narcissist. It's the one that looks arrogant, that is dismissive of other people. The one that we think of when we think of narcissism. Whereas depressed narcissism looks more like codependency. Somebody who takes the blame for everything, somebody who thinks that it's always their fault. When somebody's upset, they assume that they had something to do with it. There's still that same level of self-focus, of self-centeredness, but it has a different style, a different flavor. But it is in essence, at its core, the same thing. It is the wound, and I'll talk about this throughout. It's the wound of not being seen and loved as we are, not having a connection, a resonance with a stable, consistent caregiver who then they themselves are not wounded by this. We get to be ourselves because our parents, in this case, have healed or addressed their own narcissism. Maybe they didn't have as much of it to begin with, but they've matured, they've grown up. So we get to be mad, we get to be disappointed, we get to be upset, we get to feel our feelings, we get to be ourselves. We're not dismissed or gaslit or punished when we have an idea, a thought, or feeling that is disagreeable to the parent or comes into conflict with their own self image, with the need that they have to be the good one. The diagnosis, classically, in the diagnostic manual, I'm going to go through the 9 categories. You have to qualify for 5 of these, and I'm just going to list them vaguely. I'm not going to go into great technical detail. But the first one is a grandiosity or a sense of self-importance. The second one is preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. Third, believes he or she is special and unique and can only be understood by others with those qualities. 4, requires excessive admiration. 5, has a sense of entitlement. 6, is interpersonally exploitive, takes advantage of others to achieve their goals. 7, lacks empathy and is unwilling to recognize others' feelings and needs. 8, is often envious of others and believes others are envious of them. And finally, 9, shows arrogant, haughty behaviors and attitudes. Like I said, this sounds like the more grandiose version. This is what it's speaking to. But that more depressed, benign version of narcissism is the same root issue, the same cause. And all of it comes from something called the narcissistic wound. So here's what I wrote about the narcissistic wound. The narcissistic wound is the wound of not being seen. It might look like overvaluing from the outside, but it is not valuing the whole child or the real self of the child. And valuing the real self has little to do with the child's accomplishments, cooperation, talents, or pleasant to the parents' behaviors. Many children with whom I work express this sentiment. They equate their successes and the subsequent parental responses as affection and love. They experience praise as love, attention from their successes, from their awards, from their talents, from the parts that please the parent. They experience that as love. Parents, anxious to be seen as loving parents, lather praise to prevent any possible dip in the child's self-esteem. But again, this dynamic essentially misses the child because the child is turned to an object, merely a reflection of the parent, rather than their own person. So the narcissistic wound is the wound that occurs when we don't get seen, when all of us doesn't get seen, when the difficult parts, when the disagreeable parts, when the less talented parts, the upset parts get rejected, get punished. My mother would say to me when I was young, "You're being dramatic. You're being melodramatic," was the specific phrase that she would use, the specific term that she would use. And that was her way of warding off that feeling that she was having inside of her body of feeling overwhelmed with my needs. But instead of taking responsibility for that, she made me the problem. I was too emotional, too dramatic. I was too sensitive. I was, quote unquote, bad. And she was, quote unquote, good. She was merely, and again, all of this is unconscious, she was merely just describing the problem, and the problem was me. If she had done her work and done some healing on her own narcissistic wound, she could have held her own wound, her sense of inadequacy, her sense of being overwhelmed as a single parent, which would be easy for anybody, including me, to empathize with. She could have talked about it in the first person, said, "I'm feeling inadequate. I'm feeling powerless. I'm feeling helpless. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Nothing's wrong with what you're doing. You're just being a child, just being my child. But my limits have been exceeded in this moment, in this exchange, and I need some time. I need to take care of myself." She would have then had to tolerate my feelings and reactions to that boundary, to that exercise. But over time, I would have heard the message over and over again that she was a human parent. But instead, I heard the message over and over again that something was wrong with me because of the way that she talked about our interactions in this way. The wound, the narcissistic injury is a lack of connection and attachment in childhood. It doesn't always come in the arrogant form, like I mentioned. Sometimes it looks depressed. The depressed version of narcissism, it's not inflated, but rather self-deprecating. This type of narcissism is still self-centered, but the individual who suffers from it sees all the evidence in the world pointing to them as detestable, the problem, and the reason for others' rage. They find a way to blame themselves for what others do, think, or feel. This style of narcissism often triggers others to respond with compensating behaviors, enabling or rescuing. So all it is this place that we go to that is created, that is built, that is shaped in the context of our own parents' unhealed wounds, unhealed issues, of their own lack of enlightenment. And again, nobody blames parents, or at least I don't, for a lack of enlightenment. That's why we're here, is to learn and to grow, to develop, to evolve, to hopefully enlarge in ourselves. But to do that, we first have to grapple with who we are. We first have to come to terms with what my therapist would say for years, with our horrible, rotten selves, with ourselves, really. The part of us, the parts of us, the aspects of us that we got rid of long ago to survive. This is really where it comes down to, for me, my main pitch for this evening, my main idea. Narcissism is not a result of being overvalued. In fact, in some ways, that's really not the way that we think about it in terms of child development at all, overvaluing a child. Narcissism is not a result of being overvalued. Instead, narcissism is the result of valuing the wrong thing in the child, or valuing the child in the wrong way. To put it another way, the child is not valued. Technically, it might be impossible to overvalue a child, but we can value them for the wrong reasons, such as valuing them for being good, quote unquote, or being the easy or happy child. Many children experience praise and adoration for their accomplishments or giftedness and interpret that praise as love. In the recent Academy Award-winning movie Inside Out, the main character was referred to her by her parents as our happy little girl. After several disheartening events in her life, the young girl experienced and displayed sad and morose emotions. Subsequently, due to a lack of empathic capacity, the parents feeling overwhelmed, feeling guilty for having moved her from the Minnesota, I believe is where they came from, to San Francisco. They probably had their own guilt, their own shame. So instead of dealing and grappling with that, what do? They start to make the child the patient, the identified problem in the family. Her parents interpreted her feelings as disrespect rather than a valid emotional response given the circumstances. When we are valued for things such as our talents, our intelligence, our obedience, or our happiness, essentially we are not being seen by others. Alice Miller again talked about the need to cut the connection between being admired and being loved. And this is the way she said it. She said, without therapy, it is impossible for the grandiose person to cut the tragic link between admiration and love. That's what therapy does. You spend enough time in there where you eventually reveal yourself to the therapist. You take the risk of telling them the truth about yourself. And then if the therapist is working on this project that I'm talking about tonight, which is healing the narcissistic wound, if the therapist has done their work so that they can be themselves a human being and therefore encounter other human beings, they will love us and show capacity, patience, empathy, and resonance for those parts of ourselves that we were taught were dark, were scary, were evil, were bad and wrong. And then through that exchange, through that interaction, a transformation occurs. The person, the client, becomes more whole, more themselves. They become empowered and liberated by those things that they've shoved in their unconscious, in the shadow. They get to use the energy that is associated with those traits. They get more energy. They get their life force back. They become more creative. They become more in touch with their bliss, what matters most to them. They become more able to connect to other people because they can set aside in a given moment. They can set aside their needs because they've been fundamentally taken care of to be there for somebody else. That's really what listening asks of us. Listening in a deep way means that for the moment, I am regulated and grounded and whole enough. I can set aside my needs to hear what you have to say. For you to express your pain, your upset, your frustration, your distress. And my needs are taken care of. My needs are I'm in tune with them. So your experience with me doesn't threaten me, doesn't make me feel inadequate, doesn't make me feel overwhelmed and scared and terrified and insecure and unsure. A recent notion from pop psychology is that previous generations of children worried what their parents thought about them. But this generation of parents worry what their children think about them. That's what I've heard. I hear it all the time. If we take this to be true, if it's true that in previous generations, children worried what their parents thought, and currently parents worry what their children think, then it's the same person that's doing the worrying. They just grew up and had kids. In other words, children who were raised to worry about what others, including their parents, maybe most importantly, their parents, children who were raised to worry about what others, including their parents, thought about them, fail to develop a whole or more complete sense of self. They become wired to believe that what others think about them is true. The child then grows up to be an anxious parent, tossed about by the whims and emotions of their own children. They then ask their children to take care of them and to do for them what their parents didn't, which is provide unconditional love. I see it in movies. I see it in stories. I see it in clients sometimes. When the parent says, I don't want them to abandon me. Or my child has abandoned me. My young adult or late adolescent child has abandoned me. And what I want to say here is in the strictest terms, when we think about child development, the child can't abandon the parent. That's not something they do. Part of their differentiation, part of their individuation, part of their development requires them to go away, to become their own person. There's a story that I read from Robert Bly in his book Iron John, where he tells the story of the original myth of Iron John. And I'll shorten it to say that when the main character was supposed to find this special key that unlocked this prison, then there was going to be the key to him growing up. He was told that he had to steal the key. He wouldn't get it from his parents willingly. They wouldn't give it to him. Doesn't work that way, it was explained. And it was kept underneath his mother's pillow, which symbolically represented the dreams that parents have for us, that they think that we should be, right? We've been taught that parents are here to teach children the way of the world. But real awareness and consciousness tells us that children are here to teach us about life. They ask us to confront and deal with aspects of ourselves that we have been avoiding and running from all along. So the parent who asks the child to heal their wounds, to mend them, ends up with a child who suffers this intergenerational transmission of narcissism. Then the child learns that when I take care of mom and dad, I'm good. When I don't, I'm selfish. Even the idea of selfish itself is a problem. People will say to me when I've treated adolescent or young adult children, parents have said to me, he only or she only cares about what's good for her, good for him. And my thought, and sometimes my response is, well, of course. That makes perfect sense. Why would we want to teach them? Why would we want to encourage them to do things that wouldn't benefit them? Loving people benefits us. Being connected and kind to people benefits us. It's the idea that virtue is its own reward. It's not what you get back. It's what you become. It's what you are. The whole story of mythology and symbolism is that heaven is right here. It's available to us now. And that the reward and the punishment of hell and heaven are the way that we're living our lives, who we are in any given moment. That's the reward. Love becomes its own reward. Kindness becomes its own reward. Like I mentioned, the narcissistic wound, simply put, is the wound of not being seen. It occurs when parents are compromised. Maybe they don't have enough time, like I described with my mother, being a single mother of 3 boys, working a minimum wage job and trying to support us. with very little help from my father, she was extended beyond her capacity. It's never been hard for me since my adolescence to have compassion for how difficult it must have been for her. She was exhausted. She was drained. Maybe it's because of resources, education, therapy. Maybe it's because of their background, why parents are compromised. Part of all of this teaching that I do really is about unlearning what we've been taught, at least questioning and being critical of it, thinking critically about our assumptions. Stress, even a person who is well practiced and who has taken steps along the healing journey can still get overwhelmed in situations. I regularly react to situations, circumstances in my family with my wife and children. And the fact of the matter is that we all have some narcissism. We all have some of it. There's a threshold that one crosses where you become clinically narcissistic. That's a lot more rare than we think. What is much, much more common is that everybody has some of this. You have some of it. I have some of it. Your children have some. By definition, your children have some of it. Children, part of their natural development includes some narcissism. Part of adulthood, part of maturing, ideally, under the ideal circumstances, means that we begin to heal that wound. We begin to find other sources to parent us, other sources to give us what our parents couldn't. And hopefully, ideally, for the sake of all involved, it's not the child. And our spouse, our partners, they can only do so much because they're working out their own stuff. We all have some of it. Some uncommon thoughts about narcissism. It doesn't come from overindulgence. It might be a signal. You might see that, but it's more fundamental than that. The overindulgence is a sign of something else. It's a sign of anxious attachment to the parents from their background. It's a sign of insecurity. It's a sign of them needing to be the good parent, the good object, and therefore finding it very difficult and distasteful to upset the child. I was talking to somebody recently where in another context, in another setting, they were getting nailed by the therapist. The therapist, being a family systems therapist, just loved wagging his or her finger at my client, pointing out the ways in which she or he were failing the system, failing their child. And before I started to address the specifics of the interaction, I said, first of all, ideally, no therapist tries to get you. No therapist takes pleasure in pointing out your quote unquote bad behaviors. And just for the sake of conversation, if we were to have a discussion, I would ask that therapist, why do you think this parent in this situation is doing those things? I mean, where does that come from? What in their background would lead them to these kinds of choices, to being overprotective or enabling or codependent, controlling, manipulative? What would be the source of those behaviors? And if the therapist had any training at all, they would eventually confess that the background where this comes from is trauma. And not the kind of trauma necessarily that comes in the form of a big T trauma, but the small t trauma that I'm describing through the narcissistic development, through the thousands, millions, I would imagine billions of in interactions and unconscious moments between a parent and a child, between a child and the big people in their life. It's a trauma response. So let's not point out with some kind of self-satisfaction somebody's trauma and the symptom associated with it. Similarly to indulgence, it doesn't come from permissive, it doesn't come from permissive, gosh, I can't say that word today. I'm going to start over. Narcissism doesn't come from permissiveness. Again, that may be a sign of this underlying lack of a base, this underlying lack of self, this narcissistic wound in the parent. but itself is not the problem. It's just a behavior. It's just how it manifests. Anxious parenting is often present. Again, it's a parent who doesn't have a secure pace. My mother and father were children when they had us and when we were being raised during critical developmental phases. And because of their lack of security, their lack of a sense of self, much the same that I had when I was their age, raising my young children, because of those features, their fears and anxiety were projected outwards onto me. They obsessed about whether or not me or my brothers were doing the right thing, on the right path, going to be okay. And I began to believe in a felt sense way that something was wrong with me. That was the unconscious message of my mother and father's anxieties. I was bad. So then I spent all those years trying to be good. It led to some successes and accomplishments for sure. In my case, some people's case, it doesn't work that way. It didn't serve me well in sports. I had some natural talent in sports, but I became so sick and so nervous before games that I couldn't perform nearly as well as I could in practice because again, my identity was contingent on my success. It's why I dropped out of high school in my sophomore year because I was afraid that I couldn't be as successful as everybody told us I could be. How excited they were to talk about my potential. How excited they were to talk about my capacity. They thought that would boost my self-esteem by knowing that, but all it did for me is put pressure because the only place to go from there was down. And if I wasn't the valedictorian, I was a failure. So to take matters into my own hands, I dropped out of high school. Didn't know this at the time, never would have known it, would have never admitted it to any adult. It would have been too vulnerable. It was the fundamental narcissistic wound. I was simply valued for my brain, for my talents, for my success academically, and that was too much. Parents often can appear well-intended. Notice that I say appear well-intended. Really, the intention is for them to protect their own wounds, to ask the child again to take care of and fill in the gaps where they and their parents failed, where their parents failed with them, I should say. There is a strong link between worth, value, and accomplishments. People that have narcissistic wounding, meaning most of us, find out where we get our value. Is it the way that you look? Is it how much money you have? Is it what you do professionally? Is it how smart you are? How fast you can run? How well you can dance? How talented of a painter that you are? How cooperative, how agreeable you are? How nice you are? Pick the attribute. If those are the things that you get value for, and that's where you experience this sort of sense of connection, that's what it feels like. You get rid of the other parts. You jettison them. You split them off. They go in the closet where they mutate and become a problem later in life. Essentially, it's how you hold the child in your mind. Part of the work is deeper. That's why I spend such little time these days on skills and tools. I don't spend no time on them, but I spend less time on them because they are just, again, the outward manifestation of an internal world. The real work in parenting, the real work in working with couples is healing the individual self, looking back on their history. That's why it's so important, I think, to do something like a Finding You intensive, that individual intensive, because that is the root, the cornerstone, the basis of all else. It's born out of the attachment fractures or trauma. In part, when the parent can't tolerate us, there's a small fracture. It's going to happen to every parent. Happens all the time. Happens to all of us all the time. Then it's about making a repair, right? Coming back, apologizing, owning your stuff. These are the small T trauma. This kind of trauma, sometimes called developmental trauma, sometimes called process trauma, sometimes called small T trauma, sometimes called complex trauma. This kind of trauma, the way that somebody is around you, specifically the big people when you were growing up, that is really the stuff of which we are made. The big T's only highlight the small T's. The big T's only expose where there is or isn't the small T stuff. If you experience trauma, a big T trauma, a loss, abuse, something outside of your parents' control, and the parents are there for you, the adults are there for you, they get you into therapy, they use resources, they support you, they're able to co-regulate with you, they're able to provide a healthy container, we call it. If they can do all of that, the big T trauma doesn't have the same effect. Conversely, you can experience a moderate T, if you will, if I'm allowed to use that. And if you are abandoned in it or punished for it or told that you're overreacting or being too sensitive, that's when the symptomology, that's when the mental health issue develops. That's when it's born. The narcissistic wound and its presentation as narcissism is a mask for emptiness, for dread, for the fear of being abandoned. My therapist told me when I was a teenager, he told me that arrogance, that a superiority complex always covers up an inferiority complex. I remember that. I don't remember a lot from my therapy sessions. I've never forgot that idea. First of all, it resonated and hit me right here, right in the chest, right? I felt it. I've seen its application to me first off and to everybody else that I've ever worked with. Sometimes people are so good at the mask. The mask seems so real that you almost believe it. But people who have integrated, people who have waken up to who they are, people who have come into contact with their true self, with their real self, with their whole self, they don't display arrogance. They're not cocky. They're not overconfident. They don't position themselves one up from others. They're right alongside of you. They're really good at what I would call harmless, self-deprecating comments. They can laugh at themselves. They don't take themselves too seriously. They can admit fault. They can apologize. They can listen. The most common response for a grandiose narcissist, for anyone narcissist, even a child, the most common response I see from lay people and therapists is to try to cut them down to size. The thought is they're too big for their britches. I need to put them in their place. Right? That's the way that we think in Western culture. We think in terms of that dualistic nature. You're feeling too big, I'm going to make you feel small. But with the insight that I'm talking about today, not only is that not the cure, that actually exacerbates the problem. We see it happening all over the world today. J.D. Gill wrote in one of her books, of course, the good kid is never the real kid either. The only real kid is the whole kid. Good parts, bad parts, and those in between. And I adapted this a little bit from the drama The Gifted Child by Alice Miller. For one is free from narcissism only when one's self-esteem is based on the authenticity of one's own feelings and not on the possession of certain qualities. I'm going to read that again. One is only free from narcissism when their self-esteem is based on the authenticity of one's own feelings and not on the possession of certain qualities. Over and over and over again in psychotherapy, since I was a graduate student, the question gets asked of me by teachers, professors, by clients, how do you do it? And my answer is, how do you heal it? How do I turn insecurity, self-hatred into self-love, into a sense of self, into confidence? And my answer is, you do that the same way that the problem was created in the first place. You spend time around somebody that's bigger than you, a therapist, a mentor, a sponsor. You show them eventually the parts of yourself that you have been told to fear, told to despise. Sometimes they just fall out on the table. You have no choice in the matter. And when the person doesn't shriek or gasp or wring their hands together or wag their finger at you, when they accept you, when you walk into the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and you tell your story, the person across from you says, "Come sit next to me. You belong here. I see you. I have some sense of what it's like to be you because I am like you." Like I said, without therapy, it's impossible for the grandiose person to cut the tragic link between admiration and love. It's not the techniques, it's not even the insight. That's a part of the journey. But the real work in therapy is the stuff that happens between you. It's in the interaction. And that takes time. I've told the story not for some time now about my close friend who has since passed away. And he told me that he was in therapy, and then some months later I asked him how therapy was going when we were chatting casually. And he said he'd quit, and I asked him why, and he said, "Because I just wasted my money. I just went into therapy and lied to my therapist." And I chuckled. I actually laughed. And he said, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "We all do that. We all do that to some degree. That's part of the work." I hear people talk about experiential therapy, and I believe in experiential therapy. I ran a experiential therapy program for 28 years. I currently start Finding You programs is based in experiential therapy. We do psychodrama, we do role plays, we do other kinds of art and exercises to bring this stuff up from the unconscious, from the nonverbal parts of us. But the real healing, even at Finding You, the real healing is in the way that we hold space, the compassion, the real, genuine connection that we feel. That's why the group work at Finding You is so important. We can do one-on-one, but when a whole group under the direction of a therapist whose goal is to create safety, when a whole group responds to some of your darkest, most shameful confessions with compassion, with being able to relate and understand, that's when things change. That's when one changes. That's when one transforms. From the drama of The Gifted Child, the grandiose person is never really free. First, because he is excessively dependent on admiration from others. And second, because his self-respect is dependent upon qualities, functions, and achievements that can suddenly fail. If we find ourselves, if we make connection with ourselves, which starts through somebody else, right? The root of the self is most often found through somebody else. It's only when someone finds us that we have that experience of, ah, there I am. When we find ourselves, find our way back to ourselves, we mourn. We mourn for the life that we've lived, the lie that we've lived under about who we are. We get back our vitality, our energy. This is not a homecoming, someone once wrote, since this home has never before existed. It is the creation of a home. The child growing up must adapt to ensure the illusion of love, care, and kindness in the parent. But the adult who grows up does not need this illusion to survive. Probably the greatest wounds, not to have been loved just as one truly was, cannot heal without this work of mourning and grief. And when we realize all of our lives that we have feared and struggled to ward off something that cannot really happen any longer, it has already happened at the very beginning of our lives while we were most completely dependent. That's when everything changes. Much of this is from the drama of The Gifted Child. I wrote this some time ago. I wrote, most parents gaslight their children on a consistent basis. Regretfully, I've done it more than I would like to admit. And yes, Gaslighting your child is the sign of parental narcissism. Again, we have this idea about who narcissists are. Narcissists are out there. They're not us, they're somebody else. We like to create a safe distance between us and the disturbed. We like the badness, the narcissism to be out there in the other. Sometimes it's a conscious process, but most often all of this is unconscious. Remember, narcissists are suffering. They're scared, they're terrified. Just like you, because you have part of this. The idea is that if you really knew me, you wouldn't love me. But we play dumb about it. Most parents, and the research shows it to be around 56 to 60%, are securely attached and thus are able to provide a child with a secure attached response. I don't know where that number comes from. That's what the literature suggests. But since it's not a binary of either secure or insecure, narcissist or non-narcissist, it's a continuum. It's more gray. It's more in the middle. Sometimes people think I'm just talking about people in therapy, and I'm not. Just the idea of coming to therapy is itself a sign of non-narcissism, or can be a sign of non-narcissism. And it just because a parent has a narcissistic wound and narcissism doesn't exonerate the child. Again, adapted from the drama The Gifted Child, I wrote, the therapist may cloak his disapproval and derision behind abstract terms like borderline, obsessive, regressive, destructive, but unless he explores the 3-year-old boy inside of himself, he will not see the parallel between these terms and garden variety contempt. Part of my work as a training therapist, part of my ethic, my standard at Finding You programs, Finding You therapy programs, is that therapists understand that the work that you do with your clients is based in large part on the work that you've done on yourselves. And if you don't know that or accept that, you're limited. You're limited. And you can hide behind diagnoses. You can hide behind it. But it's not that hard to see through it. So what's the cure, the solution to narcissism? Resonating, understanding, connection, and long-term psychotherapy are often the way to heal. And if we want to be helpful, we'll practice compassion, born out of the insight discussed above. We'll refrain from hate and name-calling towards the narcissist or the generations that came before them. We will teach them about the patterns described in this broadcast, and we will be patient when they struggle to grasp them, because we will know that their wounds and their symptoms came to them honestly, and we will know that because we see them in ourselves. Perhaps most importantly, we'll be patient with others because we know that we too need that same patience. We will know this because we have gone into the dark corners of our own psyches and recognize that our demons share so much in common with the ones that we see in others. I've said this before, that the biggest obstacle in healing the narcissistic wound is success. If you're able to accomplish, I think that's what prevented some of my progress in this area for so many years, is I had success outwardly. I had academic success, I had financial and business success, and that delayed my coming to terms. And really, what revealed it were my relationships, my most intimate relationships with my wife, and how that became a struggle with my children. It is the failures that taught me the most about my narcissism, my narcissistic wounding. I won't go in depth with this, but I use this sheet on secure attachment to describe the difference just in what it looks like, what it sounds like. It's more of an energy and a way of being, but to put it in something tangible, I made 2 lists about what secure attachment, this non-narcissism would sound like in a parent versus what the lack of attachment, this narcissism would sound like in a parent. Non-narcissism or attachment sounds like when someone shares something with you, thanks for telling me. Tell me more. I appreciate knowing. I'm glad you told me. Thanks. That sounds hard. I am sorry. I'm here. I'm listening. You're not alone. That makes sense. Is there anything that I can do? You must have a good reason. I'd like to understand. What can I do to support you? I can relate. Now contrast this with the person who's in their narcissism. Here are their responses. You're being silly, irrational, unreasonable, stupid, or ridiculous. You're overreacting. You're too sensitive. You're scaring me. You're being selfish. You should fill in the blank. Don't pay them any mind. They're just jealous. Ignore them. You'll get over it. Look on the bright side. Why did you do that? Have you tried this or that? Or simply labeling it, like I mentioned earlier. That's just your depression, your insecurity, your anxiety, your narcissism, your defense, your rationalization, your justification. As I come to wrap up, I want to share with you, I shared 9 slides. I chose 6 of them here to describe what I've described, to summarize what I've talked about tonight. First off, narcissism is not a binary. That it is not that one is or isn't narcissistic. It is a continuum, and we are all on it. Narcissism results from the narcissistic wound, the wound of not being seen in childhood. Or it can be more like objectification, being valued for qualities as in being pretty or smart or talented, rather than being valued for one's inherent being. Narcissists can be malignant and or grandiose. They can be malignant and or grandiose, classic types, or they can be depressed, vulnerable. These can be common, but not that they don't tend to be as damaging overtly or obviously to others. Your romantic relationship isn't the first narcissist you have dealt with, if you see it in your partner. Our earliest context had narcissists and gaslighting, which is why we have a hard time identifying it in romantic relationships later in life. Codependent people may often identify people with boundaries as selfish, self-centered, and uncaring, and mistake them for narcissists. And when we're able to sit with an empathic, capable other, like a good therapist, we come to know ourselves, and we're able to hold on to boundaries and sit in our truth. That is the summary of what I've talked about, but I want to end with this quote that I wrote. I wrote it outside of the context of the narcissistic wound, but it applies perfectly. And it goes like this. You were wounded, more than some and less than others, but you were hurt. And the way you protect that pain hurts others, most pointedly your children. Work on yourself and discover that your fear, your hurt, and your anger are yours. Take responsibility for those feelings so your children don't have to carry them. This is the greatest love that you can give, and it will multiply. Your children will bring even greater healing to their children, and in this very simple way, your love multiplies through eternity. All right. I hope that was helpful point of contact. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity of You, talk a lot about this in a lot of ways. They're available on Amazon and Audible. Like I mentioned earlier, we have an online Finding You coming up on the 15th, November 15th through the 17th, online 3 days. It's a third of the cost of our in-person. So if time and money are limited in your life, it's a great opportunity to get months worth of therapy in just a few days. I will be hosting and facilitating the Finding You intensive on December 4th through 8th. That will sell out. We have a couple of spots left. So please sign up soon. Don't delay. Don't procrastinate. And then again in January 15th through 19th, that is going to be run by Emma, Reedy, June, and Jordan, June, her husband. And then on January 24th through 26th, we're going to be running the online program. I'm going to be hosting a Conscious Parenting All-Day Workshop, January 10th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time. And then, of course, I'm also going to be hosting an attachment-based therapy class for therapists and mental health professionals, March 7th at 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time. You can find out any information, ask for copies of the slides, sign up for any of these things, get more information by emailing us at info@findingyouprograms.com. That's info@findingyouprograms.com. My next broadcast will be tomorrow night. I'm not going to do it on Halloween, so I'm doing it tomorrow night. I'm going to be having my first Q&A in a few weeks, so please send in questions, anything you want to suggest, any questions, any topics you want me to talk about. tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is when I'll be here. Look forward to that. Like I mentioned, I hope this is a helpful point of contact. And as always, for and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thanks for showing up to these. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being willing to do your work, because it makes all the difference in the world. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.